come for the MSc launch tonight. So please do come. I'm going to pass the baton to our lovely moderator, who is going to lead us into session 7. Thank you.
Thank you, Tinash. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to this important session. We thank you for your presence this afternoon. We know it's been a long 2 days. And for that, I have 30 seconds, a 30-second activity to recharge. I want you all to turn to your neighbor and give them a big smile and share one word that, just share one word that came to your mind, that comes to your mind when you think about everything that we discussed today. Just one word. Findings, yeah. Take me as your neighbor. Thank you. I am pleased to introduce our esteemed moderator for this session, Dr. Lilian Karimi, Senior Research Fellow at the Tegemeo Institute of Agricultural Policy and Development. A round of applause for Dr. Karimi. Dr. Karimi will begin with her welcoming remarks. She will invite Mr. Alan Redison to deliver the opening remarks, and then to set the stage for our discussions around PPVC, we are honored to have Dr. Tracy representing BFAP from South Africa. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Karimi once again.
Good evening, everyone. Did you hear me? Oh, great. I have to make sure you're awake, because this is the last session of the day, but a very important session. I'm sure Tinashe said that before we left for a break. I just want to start with a few words about this project. For those who have graced our conferences, I'm sure this is not the first time you're hearing about PPVC. You may be wondering why. We spoke about it, I think, in Uganda, Victoria Falls. We spoke about it as well, and here again. And I want to say that we are excited about this project. We started by introducing or explaining to you what the approach is when we were starting this work, understanding what it entails. And last year in Victoria Falls, we shared some of the preliminary findings, what different countries were coming up with. And today, it's an important time because we want to tell you what we did, what we proposed, and where we are with those proposals. Effectively, focusing a lot on the tracking of the recommendations that have been made in different countries. So just to say, a few words about this framework. It's been variably applied across several countries since 2017, recommending specific policies and investments in various countries. You hear which countries are these and what investments have been recommended. And 6 years down the line, would like to share what policies, investments we have recommended, and what has the government have adopted, and what is still in the pipeline. And perhaps we'll get to hear from the panelists why some have been adopted while others are still in the pipeline. And so this will be a good opportunity for us as ANAPRI to look back at one of our signature projects, see how well we are doing, and also think about where to go with this. So this session will present insights from the impact generated from PPVC recommended policies and investments, focusing on the sunflower sector in Tanzania, soybean and poultry in Ethiopia, feed and aquaculture sector in Kenya, and the banana sector in Malawi. I leave Tracy to share with us the details. And so we invite you to listen to what PPVC is all about for those who are hearing about it for the first time, to also listen to the work ANAPRI has done, the recommendations we've given, and as I have said, to see what recommendations have been adopted and the impact of those recommendations. So for this session, we'll go a little faster because we are behind time, but the session is organized as follows. We'll be having opening remarks, and then a keynote presentation, a panel discussion, and we'll close the session.
PPVC project, the policy prioritization through value chain analysis work that has been part of ANAPRI for several years now. And I'll talk a little bit just about the motivation for this work. Well, it was back in 2017, 2018, where a number of the partners that I have the real privilege to work with were working on policy reforms, and governments were adopting some of those policy reforms, but I got some quite serious pushback from the big boss, Bill Gates. He said, this is quite exciting, but are these the right reforms for driving transformation in different countries on the continent? And so that led us down a path of thinking about policy prioritization, value chain prioritization, public investment prioritization. And so we approached BFAP and IFPRI, who we knew had some quite innovative modeling tools. And part of the reason we approached BFAP was because they were part of ANAPRI at the time. And we thought, well, if we can do something innovative here, something impactful, something catalytic, there's an opportunity to connect to, at the time, ANAPRI and start to scale this up across countries in Africa. And that's where we are now. So the first phase was actually a grant to BFAP and IFPRI, working with Tegemeo, Sokoine and Wapata, and it's now a grant to ANAPRI, and it's working with several additional countries, Zambia and Ghana, and we're looking at other countries as well. So the motivation was really around policy prioritization, that need to move beyond the long lists of reform needs that you see in investment plans into something very targeted that brought with it several innovations. So they were around a combination of the business case for reform, so policies that support the development of the private sector that are market focused, combining that business case with the development case. What does it mean for poverty and diets and jobs and growth, and now more recently climate, for certain policies and value chains to be prioritized? This combination of analytical tools, I would say that what PPVC has within it in terms of economic models and other analytics is world class, because I'm in a really privileged position where I work with different partners. You can see across the different tools that they're running. PPVC is right at the forefront in the world. It also is able to pull together packages of coordinated policy reforms. So rather than going piecemeal, it thinks about what do SMEs need, what do farmers need, productivity-wise or processing efficiency-wise, to drive down cost of production, make these value chains competitive to be able to serve growing urban demand, changing incomes, changing diets, but potentially also export competitiveness as well. That requires really intricate, targeted packages of policy reforms. That's another really important innovation. And then most recently, and Tracy will present some of this, tracking implementation, making course corrections in terms of what reforms are being implemented, and understanding market responses. The private sector, are farmers making the changes that we hope they would make, based on the policy reforms. So with a tax exemption, what happens to investment in processing equipment? Or with a change in a trade policy, are we seeing changes in imports or exports or whatever that trade objective is? So we can track that through PPVC. And most critically, we can track changes in farmer margins, right? We're in this as the Gates Foundation for poverty reduction for smallholder farmers, and through PPVC, we can actually see what the income changes are. These are really, really interesting innovations that the team has brought to the table. And I briefly mentioned it earlier, but at the end of each year, we're under pressure at the foundation to rank all the investments that we have. We have several hundred investments in the agriculture space active at any one time. PPVC is in the top 5, right? That deserves a round of applause, by the way, because we have a lot of great investments out there, and this is right up there with the very, very best. And not just in policy, this is R&D, this is markets, this is a wide range of activity, and it's right at the top. So it's attracting attention to the guy who sits at the very top and various other senior leaders. So, and it's because we can see the impact. It's taken a long time, it's been really hard work, but it's starting to bear fruit. So with that, I will hand to Tracy, or Lillian, Tracy.
Now we are going to hand over the mantle to Dr. Tracy Davis, who is going to tell us a little bit more, not a little bit more, why PPVC is attracting interest. We need to hear whether that impact is as great as Alan has put it. Are you attaching dollar value to policy reforms? I think I heard Alan say that before lunch. And so the presentation is on articulating policy wins for PPVC policy reforms. And the presenter is, as I say, Dr. Tracy Davis. She's the Executive Director and Manager, Commodity Markets and Foresight at the Bureau for Food and Agricultural Policy, BFAP, in South Africa. BFAP is a founding member of ANAPRI. Over to you, Tracy.
Thanks, Lillian. Thanks, Alan. No pressure after that introduction of the project, but also to not just say a little, but in a little time. So let's see what we can do about that. So it's my privilege to present to you today. It's the deck that I'm going to present was compiled by a number of researchers across a number of institutes where the project has rolled out. So I'll do my best to take you through it, but many of them are in the audience, so I'm sure they'll be happy to answer questions and also to carry on the discussion this evening at the function. So to save time, we'll skip the first slide because I think Alan has done some introductions already. But just for those that are not familiar with the project, I realize everyone in the room hasn't been to all previous ANAPRI stakeholder conferences. So maybe just a very brief introduction. And to say that I think we all know that policy trade-offs are unavoidable, and so prioritization is a critical aspect within that space. And PPVC, as we see it, is really, it's a market-led approach that strives to do this prioritization for us, using a combination of analytical tools, which we feel when you combine them is stronger than any individual one of them. So we use this package to address various aspects of the questions. Can essentially be set into 4 different phases. First, setting the scene, so just taking a look at the context in country, overview of the policy landscape, what are the initiatives that are there, what does the country want to achieve. Then narrows the focus, looking at specific indicators to value chains that we think are relevant and can deliver on inclusive agricultural transformation. From that, then picking winners. So this goes through an entire ranking process using this combination of economic modeling, insight, foresight, the various tools that comprises this system. Why have we gone back on? It seems like the slides are moving on their own here. Struggling to get on the right one. Anyway, and the fourth then, there we go, we can stand still on that one. The fourth one is then to identify policy levers. So once we've picked these winners, once we've ranked the various value chains, we then go through stakeholder engagements to choose a handful of them, and then we do what we call a deep dive into that value chain. So looking at very specific issues that are constraining to growth, how one can address them to really unlock growth within that value chain, within associated value chains, and then drive agricultural transformation. So as has been indicated, it's been rolled out in a number of countries in recent years, started in 2017 in Tanzania. There we looked at 12 value chains, 2 deep dives. Kenya in 2019, again 12 value chains ranked, 3 deep dives. Ethiopia in 2020, Malawi in 2022, and currently busy with the ranking process together with the ANAPRI Secretariat and in-country partners in Ghana and Zambia. So these countries are obviously at different stages of implementation of the project. And when it comes to measuring impact, of course, it gets easier to see impact in the countries that rolled out right in the beginning, where there's been some time for implementation, there's been time for investment to follow, and we can start to see more actions. So when we present the measurement of impact, I think one should also see it within that context, that some of them have had a lot more time to show that than others. So it's really, the project has looked at a diverse range of value chains. I think it's gone well beyond the traditional focus on food staples, often looking at high-value commodities, export-orientated commodities. When we consider the impact of the reforms that we've seen and the project as a whole, so to say, we can sort of set them into 4 different categories. So the first is early on in the work that we do, and it speaks to ground truthing data within that market-led setting. So because we use this set of economic models, and we look at various data sources, we often end up finding out quite early in the process that the starting point is completely wrong. And I think when one wants to set targets and initiate growth, it's important that you start from the right point. And if you set your targets, if you start from the right base, that's obviously a very important place. So we see that as integral in terms of its impact. There has been policy adoption, implementation in most of these countries. I think the only one where we haven't seen a concrete one is Malawi, which is really early still. The results have only just been represented fairly recently. There's also been business and development impacts. So we've seen a lot of anecdotal evidence pointing to investments within these value chains. So things changed in response to these policy actions. And then we actually saw private sector come in many instances and invest and expand their production processes. And then, of course, there's also spillover effects. So in many instances, if you make interventions in one value chain and you initiate growth, it touches on existing initiatives, it touches on alternative value chains, and you actually see a much wider effect than what was envisioned only in that very specific value chain. So as I said, it was implemented in a different context in the different countries, so I think it's important just to highlight that before we consider impacts. So Tanzania was first to roll out. It was a very direct ask from government with a short turnaround. So there was a lot of momentum behind the project, and I think we saw quite quick adoption and implementation of some of the recommendations, which actually triggered quite significant investment in sunflower processing facilities in country. This investment and this expansion then also enabled many people to benefit from some external factors in the sense of global market dynamics. When we had the war going on in Ukraine and vegetable oil prices rose, then these companies could benefit from that. And a lot of that also filtered back to our smaller producers. We also saw a correction of historic data, which didn't make sense in the analytical process, and that was corrected after. And then also in the work that we did for cassava investment, that was stopped because Malawi the same, so a very wide footprint by the local institute, the ANAPRI partners there. Gave time where things were not really straightforward, where we had a big overhaul within the Ministry of Agriculture and we had to restart and communicate the work again and get buy-in again. But initial feedback on the results that have been presented is there is being looked at some of the historic data, which again we were found to be completely overestimated in some instances. But as I said, it's early days in Malawi, so I think this is one that we'll keep monitoring and keep looking at and see where that goes in future. Struggling with the slides here. So this one is not to look at the detail, but more to look at the process. So I just wanted to illustrate how do we think about measuring impact. So of course there's many ways within which one can do this. I think we've tried to go all the way to the end in the sense that we look at what was suggested, what reforms we put out there, which ones got adopted, which ones got implemented by government. But then because this is a market-led approach, we then look at the market response. So we look at whether people have come in, whether there has been investment that occurred, whether the supply and demand dynamics changed in the market, whether prices changed, whether the product flow changed. In some instances, there were interventions were really targeted at changing the flow of the product through the market, and that was achieved. And then we relate that at the end of the day to margins. So as Alan said, are your small producers, are they really better off or not? Are they making more money than what they were prior to these interventions? And I think that's the crux of it. So we want to see these impacts through the chain, but then we want to see, does it spill all the way back to our producers, where we're looking to see additional investment in productivity gains and so forth. So with that, I'll go to some specific country examples, and we've sort of placed them in order of where we rolled out first, so implementation. The first one here is Tanzania, and we're focusing this specifically on sunflower. Oh, this mic is very temperamental. So you'll see on the slide, it's a busy slide. We've had some interventions that were proposed. So there amongst them was increased availability of high-yielding seed varieties. So many of these exist in country, but they was not sufficiently available. Then there was some VAT reforms. The one was exemption on materials procured specifically from SMEs. Should we be further away? And then, the other was on imports of processing equipment. So we were looking for processors to introduce new technology that can extract more oil from the sunflower. So the incentive was introduced for that technology to come into the country. Then there was also an increase and, more importantly, an harmonization of tariffs across crude and refined palm oil. So there was a tariff differential here, and then products got misreported as crude oil when it was actually refined, and this was causing a lot of discrepancies. Some action reforms. We've seen increased R&D budget by 37%. There was a public-private partnership initiated specifically for seed multiplication to improve the availability of these high-yielding seeds. There was subsidized OPVs distributed by government. There was hybrid seed distributed by private sector through a contract farming model. And the VAT exemptions were applied. So there was a VAT exemption on sunflower seed cake when procured from small producers, and for companies that do both, that crush and refine. So this refining was a critical step, so they had to do both of them. Some impacts that we calculated. So in terms of smallholder income, we're looking at 1.2 million households, almost 200% gain in gross margins from 2017 to 2023. Of course, these percentages can be high when it's from a small base, but when you look at the number of households and the income per hectare, that amounted to about $93 million in smallholder income in that country. There was investment to add value. So 85 million approximately spent on commercial processing equipment, mostly by big companies, but also by some small and medium crushers. That yielded additional processing revenue, so looking around $84 million in additional revenue, particularly for cake that was procured from small and medium enterprises which couldn't extract all the oil from that cake. That then flowed back into your bigger commercial processors who extracted additional oil from that cake. So this was a significant additional value add and sort of repositioned these smaller processors within the value chain. And then there was Forex saved, so about $190 saved in Forex as a result of reductions in palm oil imports. Keep wanting to go twice. So this is just some pictures. So it relates to the same impacts that we showed you previously, and just shows you some examples of how we did this. So the bar chart, the blue and the grey bar chart, that's showing gross margins across the value chain. Stand still. Right. So we looked at margins for small producers, for commercial producers, for small crushers, for your larger crushers, crushers using mechanical technology, crushers using solvent extraction technology, and then also for traders. So really looking across all the different nodes of this value chain, what was the gain in gross margins? If you sum that up, looking at $135 million in additional revenue from 2017 to 2023, where we looked at. As I said, there was investment in processing facilities. That's on the map at the top right of the slide. The flow chart is not designed to see the detail, but just that there was a redirection of product. And then the bar chart at the bottom right, that's showing just the import response, particularly in 2022 and 2023. We saw significant reduction there. So, next country. The next one that we rolled out was Kenya. Are we good? Right. You need to go very slowly with this clicker. So again, several proposed interventions. One was an increase in tariffs on imported fish. So we found that our local producers were struggling to compete with tilapia imports from China, particularly. So there was a lot of market space, but from a production cost perspective, this was a challenge. So there was a tariff to be introduced there. Not a permanent solution, so it's something that we saw as sort of a catalyst. It's a young industry to help it to grow, to reach a scale and a critical mass where local feed production, etc., starts to make sense. It can get more competitive, and then in the long term, that tariff can ultimately be removed. We asked for the removal of the duty on imported raw materials for feed production, to reduce the cost of animal feed, and then also to enable GM yellow maize imports for use in the animal feed sector, because obviously this was, that cost of raw materials was quite constraining. In terms of reforms that were actioned, we're going to try a new one. Right. We saw actually an increase in the tariff on imported fish. It was 10% to start. It increased to 25%, later to 35%. And in July 23, there was also an additional specific duty introduced. The import duty was waived on a quota of feed-related commodities. So this was maize, soybean cake, cottonseed cake. There was a whole combination of them with specific quotas attached, where the import duty was waived. Also on non-GM white maize, but then when we saw the big spike in maize prices, that was introduced as well. And then the government vacated the ban on GM imports, and this has been a bit of a process. It was vacated, and then it was challenged in court, and it's been an ongoing process until it was recently finalized, that court case. So there's probably an in terms of capital and operational expenditure in increased fish production, particularly aquaculture produced in cages in the lake. And then it was also almost $11 million saved in forex due to a reduction in fish imports, particularly tilapia coming from China. So again, if we go forward one, just to show some examples, on the left-hand side there, we've got the investment to expand. So there you can see aquaculture production, 2021-22, and then you see it ramp up in 2023. And then importantly also, there was a pipeline of investment that had been initiated but hadn't come online yet, so where production hadn't resumed. But the purple bar, that's looking at another big expansion next year. And this is products where they've started the process, but it's just not in full production yet. In the middle is fish imports. So you can see there on the right-hand side, it's highlighted with the red bar, the reduction in tilapia imports when that tariff was introduced. And then the third is the saving on inputs. So this is your animal feed materials. And there I think you can see what we put on the chart is the share of that quota that was actually utilized. And there you can see that it wasn't fully used, which is why we argue that the impact could have been better. Why wasn't it fully used? I think there's a combination of factors that contribute to that. One is the fact that the animal feed value chain per se, because of this could have knock-on effects beyond just a single, but across all the different livestock industries. So simulations on that front suggested that we could unlock GDP value that comes from expanded livestock production, which, as you can see on the right-hand side, differs by industry. So the right-hand chart shows the gross margin impact if one is to remove, and here we just looked at yellow maize into the animal feed industry. So if we allow GM imports just for use in animal feed, so we don't go into sensitive issues of human consumption, etc. But of course, if you can use that in the animal feed sector, then you release the white maize that's currently produced locally and used in animal feed into that market. So you do get some benefit also in terms of a reduction in maize prices. Some producers diversify out of maize, and then you see this impact. As I said earlier, the broad ban on GM products was vacated. It was challenged in court. It was a long process, and I think the Tega Mayo team also were integral again in continuous engagement through that process. But that has recently been wrapped up and been cleared. So as they go ahead now and look to put legislation, etc., in place, I think this is the next opportunity for that team in country to engage and to support from an analytical perspective. Again, struggling with slides. There we go. Sorry, takes a while. So the next one was Ethiopia. So of course, Ethiopia doesn't have an ANAPRI partner. We still worked with the local institute there, a research institute in country, but there's no, of course, recommended they revisit that, and then eventually they went for a 60-40 split. Interventions into the livestock master plan to prevent possible collapse of prices in that industry when you're just pumping. Small farmers were actually worse off, so their margins as a result. Small farmers were actually worse off, so their margins as a result of this price collapse declined by anything from $110 to $170 per hectare, depending on production system. So this is 23 to 35% because of this price collapse. So initially there was envisioned target improvements of around $400 million, adding 112 million to GDP and 400,000 jobs. But because this wasn't implemented as a package and only a part of it was implemented very strongly, we actually saw some negative impacts. And I think it's important to highlight that as well, because as Alan said, it's rarely one that you need to implement. It's normally a package of reforms that you need to implement to really get the effect across the value chain. All right. So again, this is just showing some pictures that goes with the reforms that we showed earlier. So the bar chart that you see, that shows farmer margins in 2022. And I have to say, this was a difficult time to work in oilseed markets with what was happening in Ukraine. So the global vegetable oil and oilseed market was a little bit disrupted. So we foresaw, if you look at the grey bar for 2023, we had already suggested that margins will come down in 2023 relative to 22, simply because of the decline in world prices following the supply response. But if you look at the purple and the blue bar there, that shows that actually came, if you look at an annual average price, it actually fell further than what we had suggested in the baseline. And if you look particularly at that harvest period price, then even further. So a significant impact there on margins compared to what we believe they could have been and what they turned out to be with this massive increase in production. Combined loss in margins, anything between 7 and 11 million. I realize that's quite a wide window, but of course, in a short turnaround, it's difficult to say the area expansion and contractions that we saw, what specific production system, how big these producers were, etc. I think what we learned is that feasibility of targets is a critical aspect of this work. So looking at the targets being set, looking at the value chain, at the market, what can it absorb, what will be the price response when we see these projections, and to balance that to make sure that when this investment occurs to expand production, that's sustainable in the long run. Because if you overshoot in the short term and prices fall too far, then your producers pull back again, and you don't unlock that investment for the longer term. And I think it really just highlighted the importance of a holistic view on implementation and investment. And I think the effort made to track these impacts really helps to highlight that in hindsight and to bring that also to the attention of policymakers. So if we go to Malawi, which is the last one and the latest country implemented. So Malawi went through the ranking process and the deep dives were presented in the middle of the year. So it's still early days, but I think the biggest takeout that we've seen initially is this historic data. So when we looked at the historic data and the historic government data, there were significant differences. So bananas around 3.5 times more being reported than what our analysis suggested there was in country. Soybeans less, only 44%, and poultry almost 3 times as much being reported as what the analysis suggested in country. So of course this has implications because they have this document of their growth targets, which is compiled based on the base of data that's 3 times less than what they think it is. So of course then your targets are also completely unrealistic if you consider that base. So I think there was a big input there, and I think a lot of in those feedback meetings it was looked at, and there's been contact with Mapwata since as well to revisit some of this and have a look at that data. So I think that's good progress. And then the last one was a request that actually followed. We're going to get to the last slide here. There we go. The last one was a request that actually followed after the deep dive results were presented. So the government officials that were in this meeting then approached Mapwata Institute and asked them to provide inputs into a policy question that they were dealing with respect specifically to banana imports. There was a lot of people lobbying for banana imports to be banned. So they went into discussion with the government, used the current state of the value chain as context. So of course in Malawi many households involved in agriculture, but only 350,000 of them in bananas per se. And margins in the sector were actually already strong. So there were other constraints to expansion, but the gross margins were looking very strong. Imports, only a small fraction, so only about 7% of total supply. And out of the 3.8 million households, only 30% could actually afford bananas at current prices. So if you then implement a policy where you're increasing prices to the benefit of your producers and those consumers have to bear the brunt of it, it doesn't seem like it's going to be a win-win for everybody. So as we said, there are trade-offs. Winners, of course, would be nurseries, farmers that sell the produce, and local traders. But then the losers would be your consumers and your traders that import the product. So we looked, when we did the simulations, around a 15 million gain in revenue due to the higher price. But then from a consumption perspective, 54,000 tons lower, which is a 28 million decline because of that affordability constraint. So of course, I think when you balance those, it's clear that the net is negative. And this then wasn't implemented. So I think that was a great input. You know, sometimes the wins are also policies that don't get introduced as much as what it is when they do get introduced. So with that, I'll leave you. I think we still have a little bit of time for discussion before our hard 6 o'clock deadline. But I think maybe just something about the lessons that we've learned. I think, you know, maintaining engagement in country is critical, and I think these think tanks within the network that have been engaged in this work have been fantastic with that. So it's really a continuous engagement. And that helps to move beyond, you know, I think in many instances there are easier policies and simpler policies to adopt, and they get implemented quickly, and then there are more complex ones that need to be implemented over the longer term. And I think that continuous engagement is really critical to achieve that. Keeping them engaged through the process, through the ranking process, through the deep dives, continuous feedback, drawing them into the work. It creates a lot of buy-in. So of course it has implications for things like the speed of delivery, but then the inclusivity of that process, at the end of the day, that continuous engagement helps you to get the implementation of the reforms that you are suggesting. We also saw that the choices, sometimes despite the rankings, are also strongly influenced by the political economy, which I think most in this room probably know, but very rarely were the value chains chosen the first 3 in the rankings. So they're always in the higher end of the rankings, but there are other factors that also influence that choice. On the approach, we still think that it's the only approach that really combines various state-of-the-art modeling techniques and analytics. It looks at a business case, it looks at a development case, and then looks where is the sweet spot in order to drive inclusive agricultural transformation. But it requires a lot of resources and it does require time to implement. There's a very detailed ground truthing triangulation of data from various sources. This is necessary to ensure good quality data into the models that we use to do these simulations, and has also often then led to corrections in historic data. And then just to say as a last one, the 2024, I think maybe has slowed a little bit in terms of the rollout of the project and the deliverables, but had a big component of capacity building, so network-wide. So we had all researchers from all the various institutes going through that process, looking at the methodology, how it can be applied, and it has been rolled out in Zambia and Ghana so far, and also set up researchers to be able to roll it out in future in other countries. So yeah, we look forward to where this goes and to expanding on this work in future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tracy, for that presentation. I hope you listened to the dollar value attached to those reforms. And I can see why Alan is excited about it. Yeah, we saw what it means when those reforms have been implemented, what it means in terms of GDP, jobs that have been added, increase in farmer incomes, gross margins, and I think that's what also our policymakers will be interested in hearing. What does this mean for me? What does this mean for the sector? And how am I going to be able to convince others that this is something worth investing in? So thank you, Tracy, for that. We've had, apart from that, we've seen that the PPVC approach is flexible, used across different value chains in different country settings, and giving us information that we can use not only to indicate at a given point in time what we would expect to be the changes due to the reforms, but the ability to track these reforms. It will be interesting, for example, to see how things unfold in Kenya now that we have the ban on the GM was lifted, and I think now regulations are being put in place. It will be interesting to see how that unfolds. And at this point now, I'd like to bring on stage colleagues that will help us discuss a little bit more on what Tracy has shared. So we have 5 panelists, and yet we have very little time. We'll see how to manage that. So please bear with me. We may engage you for a very short time, but I think that is still necessary. So the first panelist is Mr. David Ombalo Otieno from the Ministry in the Agricultural Policy Research Institute. Coming the stage. I like what he says here. He started his career as a farmer, but later turned his hand to lecturing before joining the South African Civil Service. But he is with the Western Cape Department of Agriculture. Thank you very much. And then I'll also bring on stage Kalaba, who is a senior analyst and executive director at the Bureau for Food and Agricultural Policy, BFAP, in South Africa. Welcome, Matlu. And then we have Dr. Henry Kwankwaba. I said he's an ANAPRI colleague. We see him so often, so I think we have now adopted him into ANAPRI. He's an associate research fellow at IFPRI in the Foresight and Policy Modeling Unit. So thank you very much, colleagues, for joining us. Let me join them there. You can blame Tinashe for that. Yeah, so this man will do a great job in addressing the issues that we have had. Perhaps we're not going to dwell into the numbers, but I think I'll give you an opportunity to respond to the numbers you have seen. Colleagues from Kenya and Tanzania, you've seen those numbers. You can reflect on that, but I think what I'd like to ask, starting with David from Kenya, is we have seen impacts of PPVC. They are clear, they are numbers, they are dollar values. But why do you think governments are adopting these reforms partially? Maybe that's a big question in our minds. Would you speak to that, David?
Thank you very much. Maybe I put it like this, that governments, particularly now in the case of Kenya as an example, have priorities from time to time, and sometimes these priorities do change, essentially arising maybe from the political economy. And I would want to say that in Kenya, one of the biggest reasons, one of the big reasons why there was partial adoption and implementation of some of the recommendations arising from the value chain analysis is that coming immediately after COVID and then having a new elections around August 2022, there were certain external issues that impacted the Kenyan economy around some of the key and essential commodities, particularly maize. The maize is the staple food for Kenya, and the prices of maize actually hit the roof, and this was not politically palatable. In fact, one of the reasons that influenced the outcome of the elections was the cost of living. Another issue was the cost of edible oil. And therefore, the manifestos of the current administration, though it did not change the agricultural policy fundamentally, there was a reprioritization of the value chains and approaches to addressing those two key issues that I've talked about. One of the issues that became very critical for the government was to reduce the price of maize, and the focus of the bottom-up economic transformation agenda, which was informed by the manifesto of the current regime, the current administration, was actually to subsidize production, and a lot of effort went into subsidizing the production of maize through fertilizer subsidies and the importation of, actually, because they wanted to turn around the issue of the edible oils, we even imported seed, sunflower seed, in order to have a short season crop that would ensure that we are able to get a lot of sunflower seed for processing of edible oil. So this reprioritization and the bottom-up economic agenda, which focused on food security crops, those crops for which we wanted to reduce imports, and those crops, especially industrial crops, the traditional export crops for Kenya, made a shift in terms of the focus. And therefore, some of the initial issues around yellow maize, as you have seen, some of the issues around coffee, some of the issues around beef, those still within the priority crops, I mean the crops in the better agenda, the bottom-up economic transformation agenda, they were not prioritized. And therefore, our focus now has been, the Kenya government focus has been in ensuring that we maximize on production of maize through fertilizer subsidy. I think this is the main reason that led to what you may call a shift in terms of the investments that were going on those priority crops under the value chain program.
Thank you very much, David. Political, economic considerations are coming into play. Would like to throw the same question to you, Simon. We've been enjoying listening to the case of sunflower in Tanzania. But why is the government just not fully adopting these reforms?
Okay, thanks. In Tanzania, the implementation is going on, but it is partially as the way you have said. And that one is due to several reasons. Some of them is due to budget constraints. As the way you can know, that the government has a lot of programs and so forth. Therefore, and the allocation of funds, the government its fund from revenue, from grants as well as from loans. But due to the budget constraints and the demand of the country, therefore the disbursement in each specific area also varies due to that budget constraints. Now, the second thing is just the capacity issues. Sometimes I think the implementation fails. The implementation is partially due to the fact that the capacity of the expertise is low. Therefore, there is a need to empower them in terms of training. Another thing on this capacity is just the institutional capacity. And that one is just implementation is carried out at the lower level. And in Tanzania, we have got 184 district councils where the implementation takes place. But the capacity, those who have that knowledge are in the ministry. Therefore, due to that fact, even if you trickle down the implementation, the implementation cannot efficiently take place. Now that one makes it being partially implemented. Another thing that I think is just the contextual variations, which means there is a different regions. We have got different ecological regions in Tanzania. Now, in different ecological regions in Tanzania, they have got their priorities as well as challenges. Therefore, they cannot be implemented at once. Now, they have to prioritize their areas. Now, the area of prioritization, then they have to select which one to implement at that particular time. Now, I have to submit. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. But I have a follow-up question for you and David. Maybe David goes first. You've seen the work that SUA and Tegemeo have done, working with stakeholders to doing follow-ups. And you've given us the reasons why you think there has been partial adoption. Going forward, because the work continues, what do you think Tegemeo, SUA, and other think tanks should do in order to ensure that they continue to support government demand for data and evidence.
Good. I think one of the areas is how we can deepen the engagement between research, particularly around value chain analysis and policy decision makers at the ministry. And I would say that particularly in the choices of the value chain that are also aligned to the political interest of the time, so that the value chain analysis can be informed by government priorities that also speak to the political economy. That is one area. So this deepening of engagement, continuous engagement at both technical level and the political level or policy advisory level is very important, because value chain analysis is still going to remain critical across all the value chains in terms of what their impact can be, either nationally or regionally. And just like my colleague in Tanzania has explained, our 47 counties also have priority value chains, necessarily aligned with the national value chains. So the tool is still a very, very important tool. Another area is capacity building. I think attempts were made in Kenya to broaden the capacity of government and at national level and county level actors, and we engaged Tegemeo and IFPRI, I think, to train on EPVC. And I think this training was mostly limited to the national level. We need to cascade this capacity to the county level, so that as they domesticate national policy and prioritize their value chain, they are able to put into use this important tool, so that they can make decisions that are informed by data and analytics.
Thank you, David. Simon, the same question to you.
To me also, I think capacity building is very important. And the institutions have to provide that capacity building to policymakers, especially on the interpretation of the data or information they produce, as well as the data usage. Because sometimes you may have the data or information and you take them to somewhere, to a policymaker who does not know how to translate those information. Then they can be put into cupboard without being used. Therefore, there is a need of to give capacity to the policymakers. And after giving the capacity to policymakers, then I think there is also a need of publishing those information or findings. They should be published into the forums, influential forums, and the stakeholders who are key stakeholders should have been given those informations. If they are given informations or the findings which come from the research, then they can take them and make use of them. But the influential is very important. Influential forums. If you publish in the forums where there is no influential, then there is nothing that can take place. But we need to have influential forums that can pick up the findings and make it into use. Another thing that I think is just to to conduct a tailored research. We need a tailored research. The research that are policy oriented. They reflect a policy orientation.
Thank you very much. Let's now turn to Dr. Trotsky. We didn't see South Africa, but I know you have engaged in the past with BIFAP, and you have been a consumer of the PPVC analytics. And I'd like you to tell us, maybe I'll ask you the two questions together in the interest of time. The same question I have asked my colleagues here. How can policy research institutes and think tanks get government to demand and pay for PPVC analytics? And I want you to reflect on what we had yesterday when we were talking about localization. We talked about African-led, but we also need to add African-funded. So how would the policy research think tanks get government to demand and pay for PPVC analytics? That's the first part of the question. And the second one, and I think the colleagues here have alluded to that we are not just dealing with the national government, but there are subnational governments as well. So are there variations between the functions of subnational and national governments that policy research think tanks need to pay attention to as they engage and try to leverage for funding? I hope the two questions are clear.
Chairperson, thank you very much. If you will allow me, before I go to the two questions, and I'll try to do that as one, I just want to make two comments. The first comment is, yes, you are totally right. I was first a farmer, and then I went into the teaching and government and things like that. And the reason for that is I realized it's much easier to tell other people what to do than to try to do it myself. So that's the one comment. And the second comment, in response to you saying there's no South African case study. I actually was, while you were talking, Tracy, I was thinking about the soy value chain and the work you've done in the soy value chain, where South Africa was a net importer of soil and soil oil cake to being self-sufficient in that. And that changed the whole feedlot industry to the extent that South Africa has actually become a net exporter of beef. Sorry, Namibia. We always was a net importer from Namibia and Botswana in beef. Now we are exporting. And that's all of, well, not all, but I think beef have played a very crucial role in that process. To come back, I just want to add one thing also. This morning we had a lot of talking about food security and food self-sufficiency. And why value chains are important and understanding value chains is, in the case of South Africa, the price of maize, half the year we are a net exporter of maize versus when we are a net importer of maize. Just think about the impact of that on household food security. So for that reason, it is important that we've got strong value chains on the export market, because in the end it has got the impact on household food security. And that is one of the arguments I make again and again and again at the provincial parliament and things like that, is we need to have a strong export-focused commercial agricultural sector. To turn to your questions, I think what is important is to realize that as a provincial department, we've got very limited powers. When you talk about tariffs and subsidies and national programs and things like that, we don't have the powers to make any difference at that level. Our mandate is purely agricultural development and agricultural growth, and to make sure that that happens. So we are forced to look at all potential levers. because a large part of what we need to do is to convince other spheres of government that here is a case, something that we need to invest in, and for that, the whole process of the value chains become important. I'm going to use the same example I used this morning of the brandvlei project. It's a quite simple, straightforward project, but we needed to hook that to a particular case, because government has got also limited resources. Well, to talk about the concept of government is something else, but that's a debate for another day. Has got limited resources, and when we go to provincial parliament to negotiate for our share of the budget, we have to compete against health. The health department are sneaky. Every time just before the budget cycle, there's something on the N1, an ambulance door flew off and the patient landed in the middle of the road, and it gets into all the papers. So when the Department of Health walk into Parliament, they say, we need more money, our ambulance is in poor condition. Then we have to come in there and argue for agricultural development. So we need a very strong hook to latch on our argument. And that is where the whole concept of looking at a particular value chain come in. Now, in this case, we use the wine industry as the industry to hook this on. The project has run its course, but what we now see happening in that area, it is not only the wine industry that's benefiting, because it's also about the rails, it's about the road, it's about the harbour that need to be addressed. And we see a lot of actually vines being taken out and citrus being planted and other deciduous fruit. So although the argument was originally built around the wine industry, we are also seeing other industries going strong in that case. And of course, at the national level, there's an agriculture and agri-processing master plan that is also very strongly focused on value chains. And we could give as our contribution to this national project, we could give this particular project that we are focusing on. I just want to make two last comments, and the one is about policy research think tanks. What of a thing is that? Is that something that is trying to be established outside the processes? I think the only way that such a think tank can be relevant if it is actually embedded within the policy decision-making process. And then we are not only talking about academics and government, the way I see it here, we talk about a think tank as something, government must fund something that is sitting out there, they are thinking, and what are they thinking about? And I think it cannot only be a think tank. It must be an action tank. The best way of making it an action tank is putting some sharks also in there. Then you see some action. Now, I'm joking, but I think the important thing is, it cannot be something outside the process. I might maintain, if one wants action, the people that need to take the action, whether it's private sector or government or whoever, the people that we envisage should take action at a later stage need to be part of the process from the very start. When we start with a project, the conceptualization of that project, the delimitation of that project, those role players from the private sector and government departments all should be part of this think tank, action tank. Involve everybody from the start. You get the commitment at a later stage for people to continue. The last point I want to make is, sometimes we really need to think out of the box. Let me give you an example. In agriculture, well, we are the part of agriculture. Agricultural development is our mandate. In the Constitution of South Africa, water is a basic human right. If you go into rural areas, so there's one example I'm involved in, it's a Buffeljas Dam. Literally the buffalo hunting dam, you know, so at the stage there were buffaloes, etc. But that dam, in that vicinity, is not only agricultural irrigation, it also provides towns like Swellendam and in Riversdal in that area of water. There's an absolute pure case to increase the capacity of that dam. But then it can not only be an agricultural argument. Then we must get to the argument and say, listen, it's not only agriculture, it's a constitution, it's a basic human right of having water in particular areas. So by broadening again, broadening the think tank, broadening the people involved in the process, your chances of competing at the budget cake is much better if it comes from different departments, different spheres of government, for a particular project. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Matlu has just given us a new name, an action tank. Now let's think about this action tank, ANAPRI. You've been doing a great part in capacity building. I think it's clear, it was earlier said that as we did this work, we were also building the capacity of the network members to be able to do more in different countries. And Matlu, you are involved in that process. And I know you've been thinking about how ANAPRI as a network and together with its members, how they can create demand for the PPBC tools. We've seen the tools can do great work. So what do you think the network, the think tank, the action tank can do to create the demand for such kind of tools and the analysis that comes from that?
Thank you, Lillian. And yeah, that's I think that's the question that has been going on since the opening of this conference, right? From Milu's presentation earlier on in the afternoon when we played a bit of a game, the demand from government or other stakeholders was part of, say, the solutions that we are looking for. But from the training point, maybe just to kind of go a step backward, I mean, PPVC is actually an implementation project. As Tracy was presenting, actually going through the steps, you get to a point where you have to look back and say what has happened and what difference has it made. So we should call it an action tank as it is now. And this applies to all ANAPRI centers that are in here. But I think to come to the question of demand, Tracy illustrated a bit on that when she was talking about the case of Malawi with bananas, a request from government to look at the impact of reforms that may be considered regarding, you know, the banana as an industry. That is a start, but that is a demand that was driven from the work that was done. But for me, it has two elements. A is the technical part, which is part of the capacity building. So by training from the fellows, I mean the fellows who are internal researchers to do the technical work, that for us is generally an easy task. Well, yeah, relatively easy in the sense that Milu showed the capacity, the qualifications of employees within the centers. So you have masters and above people to train. You're actually not training them. You are basically refreshing those skills, but make them applicable to these cases and combine with other tools within the PPVC. I would say that is relatively easy to train. The second component is on the softer skills, and that we have found that it's not so easy even to do. But with the softer skills, I'm referring to, you have done the research, you've done the rankings, you are able to articulate and present. But the whole process, from the beginning up until then, you needed to be engaging with various stakeholders, but in particular government. So when Tracy was showing the difference in the data that we see versus what was reported, you could see that there are anomalies there. And that means someone needs to go to different places to say, hey, this is what we are seeing is different from what you have provided. And not necessarily accusing or saying your numbers are wrong, but because PPVC is systematic, you have to account for some of the information that is coming through to say, if we are consuming so much and we are producing so little, where does the gap, how do we fill the gap? And that is not a technical skill, but it's the social and the softer skill that when you engage with those officials, they also realize the need on their side. They need to bridge data gaps because the policies and whatever happened in the past, the budgets were based on the very same numbers that need to be looked into. But just to conclude is that building those relationships over time translate banana reform into going forward. Now let's talk how we pay for this. You clearly need this, but we have to pay the lights as more powder. We have to pay the employees. Let's now get into a realistic. I think PPVC can create its own demand, and those are some of the examples that were shown in the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Matlu. Last but not least, Henry has been a technical partner, a trainer in the network, and I said we have almost adopted him into ANAPRI. But I want you to reflect on our discussion today and even since yesterday as a technical partner but outside the network. You have worked with us for a couple of months, worked with different institutions within the network. I'd like you to address the same question I asked Matlu. How can ANAPRI network or the member institutions create more demand for the PPVC tools?
Thank you so much. It's not in an interaction for months, but years now. Yes, I must say that indeed we have come a long way from the ambassadors training all the way through the affiliates. And I start with the ambassadors training. I think the concept of the ambassadors training is a very beautiful concept because it literally sells out the tools that we have to a broader audience. And these are people, we speak the language that they usually speak. We make the material understandable to a broader list of stakeholders. And I think if we were doing this quite often, it could generate more demand. We saw examples of policy demands from the Kenyan government. We have Matlo has just given an example from the Malawi government. We have been discussing with our colleagues from ISA, where we are working on rice value chains, and then with this. It creates a lot more buzz in our communities, and the work of ANAPRI becomes very, very relevant. And as we keep doing this, I have interacted with a lot of the fellows, and almost a day doesn't go by where someone calls me and says, look, we have this problem, let's say in Tanzania, and we need to address it in the following we need to address this issue, but we don't have the capacity. And then we sit down and we have our discussions, and we get modeling done. But I must also say that, yes, demand is there, and as my colleagues have already mentioned, sometimes the demand and the capacity, they don't really match, and we always need to make clear our assumptions that, okay, yes, we can model things, but not in 2 hours. We're not going to give you a full-blown economy-wide analysis within 3 hours of the work. So we need an understanding with the stakeholders. Give us the data in good time, give us the inputs in good time, and let us engage. As you're aware, prioritization is a contested issue. So I like what Dr. Trotsky said, that you have an ambulance that has spilled a patient, and now we also want soil health. So sometimes we may not speak the same language, but if we clarify the issues better, and if we make our skills known, then I think ANAPRI is in a better position to carry this. These are just my observations and my reflections over what we have been doing, but I think it's really great work. And
1, 2, and we are done. Now there are only men in this side again. If the men are more interested in these tools and analysis. Okay, let's have you go first.
Thank you. You know, recently in AGRA, we've been interested in political economy analysis, and some of it emerged actually from this work, particularly oil seed in Tanzania. We've been trying to engage agro-processors to create that demand pool, you know, for the value chain transformation. So some of the private sector we've been engaged, a Malay Singaporean company. So they were interested initially putting a crushing plant, but they pulled out. The reason they mentioned was, you know, some high-level politicians are actually smuggling refined oil into Tanzania, so will not be able to compete against that. So in your value chain analysis, do you look at some of this kind of potential, you know, political economy issues that could undermine some of the impacts and projected, you know, outcomes of this analysis?
Very much. Tracy Zena, be prepared to answer that question. The second and the last question.
Okay,
Andrew, yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Primarily, I see 4 big themes coming out. The first has to do with the fact that we do have a reliable oil, and its foundation seems to like the approach, and that is a huge opportunity for ANAPRI and its members. The second point is the fact that the engine is also working accurately, as demonstrated by Tracy. The methods are working, and that is also a good strength. We also find that in the seat as ANAPRI, there is a great strength also there. They are steering us in the right direction, but where we do have some weaknesses or threats has to do with the point that Matlu reflects on, that the soft skills to ensure that our policymakers are carried along is not quite there. And it's not because centers are not attempting to develop them. But the challenges are quite varying, and it's a moving target. So this year, maybe country A is doing PPVC, and then government changes. All the people you've been working with to get something implemented becomes a problem. So in thinking about the whole ecosystem of getting PPVC running, I think we should be very creative and form multiple associations with both those in government and those who potentially come into government. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I thought you'd clap for him. He has helped Tinashe summarize. The oil is there, the engine is there, the seat is there, but we need soft skills. Okay, Mike to Tracy, would you like to respond to that question? Okay.
Thanks. Yeah, very, very good question. I think definitely something we've encountered. I mean, I wouldn't say it's the focus of the analysis, but when you do the value chain work, when you look at the different nodes, what the challenges and constraints are, it's something that does often come up. And I think in Tanzania, it was specifically something that came up. How you deal with it, I guess, is not always a straight and simple solution. It was part of the reason why we recommended at least the harmonization of tariffs, because within the tariff differential was an incentive to declare wrongly and bring it in like that, whereas the harmonization at least closes that door a little bit. I think there was some success, but not complete success. I think that's probably what I can add. I don't know, Zena, if you want to add some more. I know you worked quite actively on that as well.
Yeah, what Tris said is very correct. Yeah, the model looks on the value chain in general, so it identifies the challenges along the value chain. And as you said, when it comes to implementation of the recommendations, that might bring some challenges, because we see, like in Tanzania, initially they look at the tariffs, and some of the tariffs were raised. And then we saw the now correct declaration of, not declaration, correct classification of the palm oil. If it's refined, it's refined. If it's crude, it's crude. Yeah. But later, we saw some changes again. Because of COVID and the Ukraine war, we saw the tariffs again, they were lowered for the palm oil. And then we saw palm oil coming in. And again, there are other political issues. The illegal importation of oil is there. So when it comes to implementation, sometimes there might be some challenges. So what we need to do is a close engagement again. Yeah. If you do a close engagement, you can report, you see now, these are the numbers. Like we're looking at the importation of palm oil. Look at the official data. It was showing that the imported palm oil, the volumes are very low. But you look at the market, there's plenty of oil in the market. So you tell the government, what is this? Something is happening, we need to do something. So a continuous engagement can try somehow to address these challenges. Thanks.
Thank you, Tracy and Zena. Please join me in appreciating this panel. Thank you, and appreciate yourselves, especially those who had questions to ask and they didn't ask. You stayed engaged, and I think we'll continue this discussion over dinner and in the next ANAPRI conference. There'll be new things coming out of Malawi and somewhere else, Ghana, I think. So we look forward to engaging with you more. Thank you very much.
Fantastic.
Just a second for the picture. Just a second for the group picture.
Great.
Yeah, you can stay up. You can stand up. Yeah, Dr. Tracy and Alan.
with permission from the MC, from here we will adjourn, and at 6:30 sharp we have to meet for our cocktail. We have an evening function where we are going to launch the Modeling Services Center, and we will talk some more. I think those who had questions, we can thrash it out over finger supper and wine and beer. So we look forward to seeing you. I think the cocktail is just right here. Yesterday, where we were at yesterday, we will just meet at that spot. For those who don't know, I think you just turn left here, and then there's a section right at the end. You will probably see, because there's some decor that is reflecting that there's an event for us there. So we look forward to seeing you in about 20 minutes for the cocktail, and we can catch up then. Thank you very much.
Just a reminder of the private sale of local outfits, local clothes. It's taking place right now at the room scene. Private sales of local clothes. I think this is not working properly. Yeah, the room scene. The room scene. Thank you. In the room scene, SINE, you will find a private sale of local clothes. Hey. Private sale. Private sale. Local clothes.